Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to the broken ground beneath the front between New Antioch and Jerusalem, where engineers fight a buried war of listening, bracing, and murder in the dark. There, under St. Barachiel's hollow, one sapper learns too late that the enemy above him was only ever the guide rope leading him towards something far worse. My name is Elias Varden, senior sapper, second class of the 3rd Antiochean Mining Company, attached to the Jerusalem front and posted beneath a shattered ridge between New Antioch and the Holy Roads eastward. Before that posting, I believed underground war was terrible in a clean, measurable way. A man could endure almost anything if it had shape. Pick against pick, charge against brace, listening gallery against listening gallery. There was fear in it, yes, but it was practical fear. Fear you could answer with timbers, maps, fuse, and muscle. I thought the earth below the front belonged to whichever side had the steadier hand and the more patient engineers. I was wrong. In the weeks before the collapse, I still believed the enemy tunnels were only tunnels. I believed every scrape beyond the wall was a pick, every muffled thump a charge being tamped into place, every missing man the work of Heretic sappers and nothing worse. That belief was the lie that made the dark bearable. Once you tell yourself another man is making the noise, you can answer him with drills, timber, powder, and prayer. You can imagine rules, you can imagine limits, you can imagine the earth is still a battlefield rather than a mouth. By the time I understood otherwise, too many of us had already been guided where the enemy wanted us to go. I was born in the culvert district of New Antioch, where houses leaned over narrow lanes and the drainage channels mattered more than the beauty of any wall. My father repaired cisterns and rain tunnels. My grandfather had been a stone man before him, one of those quiet, practical laborers who understand that cities survive not because banners fly over them, but because water goes where it ought to go, and foundations hold when the ground shifts. I grew up among lime dust, measuring rods, and the serious voices of tradesmen discussing cracks as if they were weather omens. Other boys were taught saints' lives and sword drill. I learned to read settling lines in plaster and tell, by the smell in a closed cellar, whether the air below was merely stale or ready to kill. The army noticed. The church always notices useful boys, and in wartime, usefulness is another word for ownership. At 19, I was in the engineer corps learning military mining. At 23, I could calculate a charge by candlelight with wet hands and no proper table. By 29, I had already served beneath 2 fronts, both ugly, both dangerous, neither of them anything like St. Barachiel's Hollow. That was the local name for the old workings under our sector, St. Barachiel's Hollow. It sounded pious enough to comfort officers who never descended below the 2nd level, but the older miners in the company said it had not always been called that. They did not know the earlier name, only that names in old places change when men want memory buried under something holier. The surface above the hollow was unremarkable by frontline standards, a ridge reduced by artillery to chopped marl, torn wire, crater chains, and low parapets from which one could watch the dead brown no-man's land sagging between Antiochean and Heretic positions. But below that ridge existed another front altogether, a front of listening tubes no wider than a coffin, a front of old silver shafts widened by military necessity, a front of timbered crawls, bad air sumps, drainage cuts, lamp niches, sandbag traverses, and chambers so old no one trusted the dates on the plans. If you have never served underground, it is difficult to explain how quickly the dark acquires personality. In open trench fighting, the sky remains above you no matter how cruel the shells are. Underground there is no sky, only weight. Weight in the ceiling, weight in the walls, weight in the knowledge that every timber around you is a temporary argument with gravity, and every passage is a polite request for the hill not to remember it is a hill. Men change below ground. Loud men grow quiet. Careless men either learn reverence or die in ways that educate everyone else. Humor becomes sharper because fear strips it clean. Sleep becomes suspicious because lying down in the earth feels too close to surrender. Our company held 3 principal branches in that sector, east, west, and south, all connected by a central chamber 30 feet down where stores, maps, and the sleeping pallets were kept. The eastern branch was our most active line of contest, running toward suspected heretic saps that sought to undermine our forward trench. The western branch was mostly defensive, a set of old listening galleries and countercharge pockets left from earlier campaigns. The southern branch, according to the maps, entered older uncertain ground where ancient mine scars and collapsed headings made accurate surveying difficult. Any engineer reading those plans would know the truth at once. The southern branch was where knowledge became guesswork, and guesswork underground is a polite cousin of suicide. The company itself was a little world with its own hierarchy, grudges, habits, and weather of mood. Mining companies in wartime are not formed from one class of man. We had city masons, quarry laborers, railway tunnel hands, ruined farm boys, punished infantrymen reassigned to work details, and 2 former silver miners who considered military methods barbaric guesswork practiced by amateurs. Men who would have disliked one another bitterly in daylight trades learned to rely on one another below because the earth kills without caring who was right in an argument. That imposed fellowship creates its own kind of intimacy. You learn who swears when frightened, who grows silent, who lies about pain, who cannot be trusted near fuse after too little sleep, who listens more carefully when ashamed. Routine gave shape to that world. Before each main shift, the first man down the ladder line checked the air with a lamp and mouse cage. If the flame guttered or the animal showed distress, nobody argued with the result. Tools were counted out by type and returned by count because a missing mattock underground can be the difference between a trapped man and a recoverable one. Waste spoil went not where convenience suggested, but where future collapses would least resent it. Every passage had its own etiquette. In the East Branch you kept voices low because sound traveled. In the West you tested each third timber with your knuckles because the roof was old and touchier than a bishop. In the South, by unwritten agreement, nobody whistled. Meals below were practical insults issued at regular intervals. Hard bread softened in broth if fuel allowed. Salt meat, beans, coffee black enough to clean a rifle spring. Yet even there men clung to little rituals of civilization. Thomas always divided any cheese by exact eye without a knife, proud of the trick. Micah read Saint cards while chewing. Janik preferred to eat near the vent shaft where he said the air tasted less already used. Father Soren would walk the chamber once before resting, touching certain posts and lintels as if taking attendance of the wood itself. I never asked whether those touches were blessings or habits learned from fear. Underground, the difference is small. My immediate section was led by Sergeant Bale, a hard man in the way of old professionals who have outlived too many younger, kinder men. He shaved daily, even underground. Claiming whiskers near naked fuse were a declaration of contempt for the Almighty. Thomas Heller was my right hand in all things practical, broad-shouldered, scarred across both wrists from a cave-in years before, with a voice rough as cracked timber and the steadiest hammer-hand in the company. Micah Reeve was youngest among us, too quick to smile above ground and increasingly unwilling to do so below it. Janik Vale, our best listening specialist, had half lost one ear in a misfire and somehow turned the damage into a gift. He listened through wood and stone like another man reading letters. Father Soren, assigned as tunnel confessor and blessing officer, moved through the galleries with an unsettling quiet that made him seem less like a priest than a patient bird haunting a crypt. We lived in the earth by cycle rather than by day. 6 hours listening, 4 hours digging, 2 hours timbering, then whatever sleep shelling, alarm bells, and bad nerves permitted. Lamps were hooded blue where possible because warm light carried too far around bends. Boots stayed half-laced even at rest. Rifles hung on pegs within arm's reach. Charges were wrapped and catalogued with the care some men reserve for relics. The sleeping chamber held a row of low pallet frames, a brazier in a side alcove when fuel allowed, peg lines for tools, a shelf of notebooks and amended maps, and an atmosphere of permanent damp. Wet timber, lamp smoke, men's wool drying too slowly. The smell of clay worked by human hands into temporary obedience. In those first weeks, the enemy was active, clever, and almost reassuringly human. The heretic engineers beneath our sector were skilled enough that no honest man could deny it. They cut quieter than most, favored curving approaches that defeated straight listening lines, and used tarred wicker vent trunks instead of the noisier metal ducts our own quartermasters insisted on supplying. They laid false headings. They masked spoil. They tamped charges with rubble and broken masonry so that every blast seeded splinters through the ground. In another war, or on another front, I might have admired them without reservation. Here, admiration had to share space with hatred and fear. At first, the underground contest followed familiar laws. We listened, triangulated, counterdug, and laid camouflages to collapse their approaches before breakthrough. They answered with shifts in direction and feints against our ventilation runs. We tracked seep water, watched dust patterns, and marked every faint vibration on amended plans because underground maps are never true for long. They are confessions of partial ignorance corrected in pencil until the next correction kills somebody. The first week, I helped bury 2 enemy probe teams without ever seeing their faces. We identified a probable sap approaching our east branch by the rhythm of cut and clear scraping behind a clay seam. Sergeant Bale authorized a quick chamber under their line. Thomas and I packed the charge. Janik listened through the wall and marked the timing. When we fired, the earth gave a short inward cough and settled. No dramatic burst, no cinematic violence, only a subtle change in pressure, and then, some moments later, faint hammering from beyond the collapse. Rescue work, I told myself, or dying men. Underground, those are often the same sound heard from different sides. We should have felt we were winning. We did not. Every time we stopped an approach on one side, pressure emerged elsewhere. A suspicious ventilation draw in the rear. A tapping line too far south. A false noise meant to drag listeners off station. We answered each threat efficiently. Each answer, without us fully appreciating it at the time, gave up cleaner ground and bent our attention toward the southern branch. During the second week, our work settled into the kind of brutal routine that convinces men they understand a place because they have survived it several times in succession. That false familiarity is one of the Earth's favorite ways of softening you. Each shift began with roll call in the central chamber, where Sergeant Bale would point at the amended map with the stem of a broken spoon and assign labor as though selecting butchery cuts. Listening pairs to the east, brace teams to the west, vent clearance, spoil haul, countercharge prep. One reserve file to remain half-rested in case a breakthrough alarm sounded. We spoke in practical terms, made rude jokes, sharpened tools, and told ourselves that anything we could schedule could not truly terrify us. The routine deserves telling properly, because that was the skin stretched over the thing underneath. A standard work cycle in St. Barakiel's Hollow began before a man's body was ready for it. Relief would be roused by touch rather than voice, because nobody wanted sound carrying into the galleries before the listeners had been changed. You woke, confused, wet cold at the shoulders where the chamber damp had soaked through blanket and coat, already tasting the old lamp smoke that clung to the sleeping air. Your first sensation was never courage. It was inventory. Boots, belt, knife, lamp, water, gloves if they were dry enough to count as gloves. Then the half-crouched shuffle to make room for another man pulling on his kit beside you in the dark. From there, everything divided according to necessity. Listening pairs went out first, because every other task depended on knowing which walls were safe enough to offend. Digging files followed once fresh soundings came back. Brace parties carried timber in awkward relay, shoulders bruised by rough-cut loads and hands furred with splinters. Spoil men hauled broken marl and clay to whichever dead branch had most recently been selected as the least dangerous place to anger the hill with more weight. The ventilation detail were the least envied of all, because vent maintenance meant crawling old narrow runs where stale air, rat nests, and forgotten debris gathered in pockets too mean even for active miners. Yet, if the vent men failed, everyone below paid for it with headache, sluggish hands, and eventually graves. We measured each day not by sunlight but by tasks completed before the air turned thick. 2 braces replaced before first ration, 15 feet of crawl cleared before relief, 7 sacks of spoil shifted from the east sump. 1 suspect seam sounded and marked for later charge. 1 fuse bundle dried near the brazier. 3 lamp chimneys blackened and scraped clean. In the abstract, those facts sound small. Lived underground, repeated without comfort, they become the whole texture of war. The mind narrows to inches, because inches are what keep roofs from descending. Even our meals fitted that grim intimacy of labor. Broth was swallowed leaning over survey boards. Bread was eaten while checking timbers. Men drank coffee beside live powder because fatigue had eroded reverence and no one had energy left for ideal discipline. Thomas could judge the severity of a shift by how much chewing was audible. On easier days, men talked while they ate. On hard days, there was only the wet grind of jaw work and the occasional clink of cup on stone. The worst days were those when nobody even seemed hungry because fear had climbed above appetite. The tunnel war deepened by inches. At the eastern branch, we found an enemy sap advancing beneath a layer of stubborn blue clay that carried vibration unusually well. Yannick heard it first and marked the rhythm as two cutters, one clear man, one slower laborer on spoil. Instead of charging immediately, Sergeant Bale chose a quieter answer. Thomas and I widened a side crawl until we could chamber beneath their projected shoulder. Then we packed the pocket, not with enough explosive to create a dramatic collapse, but just enough to break the floor under their knees and dump them into their own half-supported heading. When the camouflage fired, the report was so small a surface officer might have mistaken it for a dropped crate. 5 breaths later, we heard panicked scraping, then a long, rattling slither as their timbers failed in sequence. Micah grinned like a boy at a fair until Father Soren reminded him there were men under that fall. Micah stopped smiling, though not because he regretted the result. Underground work teaches you to feel pity and necessity simultaneously until both become dull from overuse. The enemy answered with ingenuity of their own. They cut a false vent slit into a natural fissure and fed warm air and coal smoke through it so we would overestimate the size of the working beyond. They used hollow timber mallets in one heading so the sound carried farther and convinced us their picks lay 30 feet from their true line. Once they embedded a brass devotional disc in a wall seam where any pious sapper might assume it marked an older Antiochene support point. It concealed a narrow drilled tube through which they could hear half our chamber talk if men grew careless with their voices. I discovered that device only because the disc was polished too recently and the dust around it had the disturbed look of something touched by fingers rather than age. They also learned our habits with uncomfortable speed. If a brace team labored long in one gallery, nuisance tapping would begin elsewhere to tempt us into thinning security. If shelling above forced us to pause work and check surface stability, pressure below would appear within the hour on whatever line had temporarily lost oversight. More than once, they let us find one of their approaches too easily, which is the sort of gift no prudent engineer accepts at face value. The discovered heading would be competent, dangerous, and perfectly suited to absorb our counter-effort. Meanwhile, some quieter, less dramatic route gained 20 feet beyond our attention. They were not merely contesting ground, they were manipulating where we spent our caution. One of their nastier tricks involved water. Old workings below St. Barachiel's Hollow held pockets of trapped seep that could be released with a few careful blows. On 3 separate shifts, we found our freshest cuts, suddenly slickened by cold, muddy trickles where no water had been before, not enough to flood, enough to soften the floor, foul measurements, and make brace footings unreliable. Twice a whole day's labor had to be repeated because the enemy had turned good clay into slop from some hidden higher seam. I spent one entire watch lying flat in mud with my cheek against the floor, tracking the angle of the incoming seep by touch while Thomas scraped a tiny channel beside my hand. We finally located the feed and plugged it with burlap, wedges, and a saint's amount of swearing. By the time we finished, both of us were blue-lipped with cold and too tired to resent how proud we felt. We learned and answered in turn. We stuffed their listening tubes with greasy wool and powdered lime. We dug shallow echo niches that made one man with a shovel sound like 3. We suspended iron nails on twine in the quieter galleries so the slightest pressure wave would make them titter together like nervous teeth. We built dummy brace stations, complete with stacked timber and tool scuffs, to suggest defensive emphasis where none existed. Once, for nearly 2 days, we maintained a complete theater of labor in a dead west spur, Whispered orders, muffled hammering, lamp movement seen through cracks, while our real team silently cut a countermine 2 levels below. When that charge fired, it collapsed not 1 but 2 enemy approaches, and the cheer that went up in our chamber afterward was the loudest I ever heard underground. For a brief span after that success, the company's mood changed. Men stood straighter. Someone sang half a marching hymn while sorting fuses and was told to shut up with less venom than usual. Even Micah laughed when Thomas remarked that at last we had made the heretics do honest digging in their own graves. Bale did not join the mood, but he permitted it, which for him was almost indulgence. We ate hot broth that shift, and because the shelling above had eased, the vent drew clean enough that the chamber smelled almost human instead of buried. It is important to remember that we were not miserable every second. Periods of rough confidence existed. That is why the trap worked. A man who is frightened without pause eventually breaks. A man alternately frightened and reassured can be led much farther. The cheer died quickly. Victory below ground never lasts long enough to trust. The earth absorbs triumph. Dust settles over it. Then some new tap begins in another wall and reminds you that all your cleverness has only purchased a little more breathing room. It was around then that sleep itself turned hostile. Men on the surface speak of trench sleep as if it were merely short and interrupted. Underground it becomes stranger than that. You do not fully surrender to it. Your body lies down, but some narrower, harder part of the mind keeps listening through whatever dreams try to gather. Men jerk awake with tools in hand. Boots stay close enough to find blind. Every bedding space acquires a private superstition. Len would only sleep with his head toward the chamber entrance because he said no decent thing ever came from having the dark at his back. Arvo folded his coat under his neck because he had once woken in a Balkan shaft with a blind white rat chewing his collar. Thomas slept flat on his back with hands crossed on his chest as if rehearsing for burial, which he found amusing and everyone else found grim. It began with noises so small that each by itself could be dismissed. The sound of someone turning over when no one had moved, a little wooden click from beneath the pallets as if a bead had rolled across boards, the soft complaint of stretched rope after the wrist tethers were introduced. Micah woke one night insisting he had heard boots pacing between the sleeping rows, but the ash line across the threshold remained untouched and the lamp showed only exhausted men pretending not to be alarmed. The next night, Thomas claimed he had heard breathing from directly under his own bed frame. We lifted the boards and found damp earth, beetles, and nothing else. The night after that, one of the infantry support men on temporary attachment punched Father Soren in the shoulder because he woke to see a crouched shape by his feet and lashed out before his mind caught up to his fear. The shape had been a coat hanging from a peg. That is another thing the earth does. It taxes certainty until every object must be identified from scratch each time you see it. By the end of that week, none of us were properly rested. The company surgeon could do nothing with that. There is no tonic for the knowledge that if you sleep too deeply, the dark may take an interest in you. So we pushed on with our duties as soldiers always do, converting exhaustion into procedure and procedure into character. Men became more brittle, jokes grew crueler. Small errors that might once have earned a laugh drew curses sharp enough to make the lamps tremble in their hooks. One afternoon, Micah nearly killed Len during a routine brace replacement because he mistook a hand emerging from dust for an enemy breakthrough. We had been swapping rotten uprights in a sagging side run when a shell landed somewhere above and shook the soil hard enough to shower us with marl chips. Len, half hidden by the dust cloud, reached through the haze to pass a wedge. Micah screamed, drove his entrenching tool forward, and would have buried it in Len's throat if Thomas had not caught his forearm. Len answered with language inventive even by sapper standards. Micah backed against the wall, shaking so hard he could not stand. And afterward nobody mocked him because every man there understood how thin the skin of perception had become. The tunnel war gave us no mercy for that weakness. Heretic pressure came in pulses that looked random until you studied them over days. First a threatening cut toward our east branch, then silence. Then a probe against an older Western support line we had no choice but to inspect. Then a burst of hammering below the central chamber strong enough to make men glance downward while pretending not to. Then another outward push at the east. Tactical nuisance, each event on its own. Strategic guidance, taken together. They were like shepherd dogs nipping wherever needed to keep a flock moving down a chosen lane. One counter-tactic of theirs impressed me enough that I still teach it when instructing young engineers. They began leaving partial collapses instead of complete ones. Most miners, given a detected enemy heading, either keep it open for ambush or smash it shut entirely. The heretics in St. Barachiel's Hollow sometimes broke a gallery just enough to leave survivors baiting rescue effort. You would hear frantic digging from the far side, infer trapped men, and shift your own posture accordingly, listening here, reinforcing there, expecting desperation. Then, when you committed resources, the apparent rescue noise would stop and real pressure would bloom in some cleaner route. Whether they sacrificed their own wounded deliberately or merely exploited our assumptions, I cannot say. But it was effective, and effectiveness is the only morality war consistently rewards. We developed a response. Instead of treating every trapped man sound as immediate evidence of nearby enemy manpower, we began timing the intervals between impacts. Real rescue diggers tire, reposition, mutter, and work with emotional inconsistency. Staged noise keeps a machine's discipline. Janik could distinguish the difference with unnerving accuracy. Once he listened to a supposed rescue effort for 5 minutes, then sat back and said, "Too regular, either saints with metronomes or liars." We ignored that heading, shifted 2 men south where he suggested, and intercepted a quiet advance toward the old, uncertain ground. Again, a small victory. Again, another step nearer lower Pilgrim vein. The southern branch itself changed as more traffic ran through it. At first, it had been merely the least loved corridor in the complex. Low roof, older timber, chalk marks from forgotten survey teams. Under continued use, it acquired a temperament. Lamps burned there with a stingier flame. Voices carried oddly, as if the tunnel chose which words to pass along. The walls shed a dry powder unlike the wetter marl dust elsewhere. Even the smells differed. Less rot, less standing damp, more old stone warmed by hidden air. Men began inventing excuses not to be assigned there alone. If Bale noticed, he never said so, but he quietly stopped posting single sentries in the southern approaches and moved to pairs. That branch troubled me from the outset, not because of any one catastrophe, because of the plans. Old mine plans are full of lies created by haste, pride, and dead surveyors. But St. Barachiel's southern sector contained a particular kind of lie. Areas rendered only as shaded uncertainty, collapsed workings labeled with devout later names, traces of earlier headings crossed out so thoroughly the ink tore the paper. Whoever had amended those older plans had wanted certain routes forgotten, not merely updated. On my 3rd night shift, I found one survey from decades before with a notation in faded military shorthand. Lower Pilgrim vein. Do not reopen without ecclesial authority. The authority reference had later been scraped away, leaving only a scar in the paper fibers. I showed the notation to Thomas while we were checking timberloads by lamplight. "Pilgrim vein," he muttered. "Silvermen don't name seams for pilgrims." "No. What do they name them for?" "Saints, investors, colors, wives, jokes." Thomas stared at the scraped note for a while. Then someone renamed it after the first name got unpleasant. That was his way. Blunt enough to make unease sound practical. I appreciated it. The first disappearance happened 3 days later. We reacted as competent men do when competence is still possible. Bale doubled the sentries at once and put them in pairs so neither man could later swear he had imagined what the other denied seeing. I had bell wire run ankle-high across both approaches to the sleeping cut, dust laid fresh beyond it, and chalk marks renewed on every threshold and brace post. No one was to move alone, not even to piss into the sump bucket. Lamps were trimmed high enough that the chamber never fully darkened. At each watch change, Thomas made every man answer by name and touch the shoulder of the man sleeping nearest him. We even tied a light cord through the blankets of the outermost sleepers, so that if someone tried to draw a body away without waking him, the pull might rouse the whole row. None of it comforted anyone. It did, however, make the later vanishings worse, because every new precaution that failed stripped one more layer from the belief that discipline governed the hollow. Before it did, there were enough warning signs that a wiser company might have withdrawn from the hollow entirely. But armies do not abandon useful ground because engineers feel watched in the dark. They demand specific causes, measurable failures, visible bodies, reports with verbs neat enough for staff officers to underline. St. Barachiel's hollow offered none of those at first. It offered only atmosphere, and atmosphere never defeats a military necessity on paper. So the work continued. In fact, the days just before Karl vanished were among our busiest. We had an active enemy pressure line to the east, a settling issue in the west, and continuing uncertainty in the south. Such overlap is precisely how bad patterns hide inside ordinary workload. A man notices dread best when he has leisure to feel it. Give him 6 urgent practical problems, and he will carry dread in his spine for days before naming it. I remember one full cycle from that period with painful clarity. During first watch, I helped recut a brace pocket in the east branch after a support shoe cracked under load. The clay there came away in dense, cold slices that stuck to the shovel like meat. From there, Thomas and I relieved the listening pair in Gallery 12, where we spent nearly an hour distinguishing between genuine enemy scraping and the sympathetic knock of distant surface shelling transmitted through a marl rib. After ration, Micah and 2 spoil men shifted 20 sacks from the central chamber to clear space for replacement timber. Before they finished, a messenger came down from the line requesting immediate assessment of a subsidence bowl opening behind the forward parapet. Bale took a file topside. The rest of us remained below. By the time he returned, Father Soren had blessed 3 fresh charges. Len had split a thumbnail to the root. Janek had identified a probable decoy tapping line, and I had amended the southern map twice because old measurements would no longer sit honestly against new wall angles. Nothing supernatural occurred in that cycle. That is precisely why it matters. We were being stretched thinner than we admitted, and stretched men can be guided. On the next cycle, the enemy advanced a hooked probe through a weak seam above shoulder height, evidently testing whether we would reveal our position by chopping it away immediately. Bale made us leave it in place for 2 hours while Janek listened elsewhere. The restraint paid off. Instead of committing bodies at the seam, the heretics used our expected concern to mask work under the southern bend. Thomas and I cut a hurried countermine there by lamp smoke thick enough to sting tears from the eyes, and when we finally broke into their route, we found it abandoned minutes earlier. Warm tools, fresh scrape marks, and one strip of dark cloth tied neatly around a broken peg as if left in salute. Such little gestures accumulated. None proved anything. All of them exerted pressure. I kept a log then. Not the official one, but my own little pocket notebook wrapped in wax cloth. In it I marked not only gallery lengths and charge estimates, but moods, smells, and absurd observations no regulation form would permit. Day 9. East branch air warmer by 2 breaths than yesterday. Day 10. Unknown scrape in south line at first prayer. Stopped when Soren sang responses aloud. Day 11. Micah claims he saw chalk marks move after lamp passed. Possible fatigue. Day 12. No rats in lower stores anymore. Concerning. Looking back, the notebook reads less like engineering and more like a man trying to persuade himself the inexplicable can be tamed by being itemized. Above us, the front remained ugly and ordinary. Shelling, sniper fire, rotation complaints, mud thickened with horse blood and broken wicker. That normality became a kind of insult, because whenever we came topside, the sky looked too open for what we knew lay below it. Men from line companies joked about us moles and grave worms. They envied our relative shelter from artillery and had no idea what sort of shelter the earth provides when it begins taking an interest in those inside it. Around the 10th day, Sergeant Bale instituted what he called discipline against imagination. Every man coming off a southern shift had to report one practical fact before speaking any rumor. A fissure line, a support weakness, a new seep, a measured change in air. The goal was not to forbid fear, but to make it pass through the filter of useful language first. Sometimes it worked. Often it merely made men sound more haunted in better vocabulary. One night, Len reported very carefully that the south line smelled like a chapel where meat had been hung too long. Bale stared at him for a moment and simply wrote, "Air quality abnormal, check venting." The venting was checked. It explained nothing. We had come off a listening rotation shortly before dawn, though dawn only meant the hour when the surface artillery changed pattern and the ventilation shafts breathed a little differently. There were 11 men in the sleeping chamber by my count when I lay down. Karl Stumm, a narrow, quiet labor sapper from the western quarter, took the pallet nearest the rear wall. He complained once about his feet, rolled into his blanket, and went still. Father Soren sat near the chamber mouth, reciting office under his breath. Sergeant Bale checked the lamp ration and swore at the quartermaster. Thomas called Micah an idiot for not drying his socks. It was an ordinary end to an ugly shift. When I woke perhaps 2 hours later to the clatter of a dropped cup, there were 10 men in the room. Carol's blanket had been thrown back. One boot lay under the pallet. His lamp, cup, rosary of tin nail heads, and folded coat remained exactly where they should have been. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no scrape marks leading to the entrance. The chamber had one proper way in or out, and Father Soren, pale with tired embarrassment, swore nobody had passed him. We searched every accessible branch above the sump line, latrine niches, dead-end stores, fuse alcoves, the abandoned listening spur with the bad roof, even the sealed side heading whose brick closure bulged inward as if something behind it leaned and listened. No Karl. The only trace was a faint drag disturbance in the dust near the chamber's rear wall that ended beneath a shelf of spare wedges and did not continue anywhere beyond it. Company command called it desertion under stress. We understood why. Desertion fits reports. Desertion can be punished in the abstract and filed by noon. But no sane sapper deserts barefoot underground, leaving his lamp behind. No sane sapper chooses the dark unlit with enemy tunnels nearby. Sergeant Bale said as much in words harsh enough that the clerk taking the report pretended not to hear them. That night, nobody slept properly. We set a double watch in the chamber. Lamps burned low. Every creak of timber produced a flinch somewhere. Once, near midnight, Tomas seized my wrist and hissed for silence because he thought he heard breathing under the pallets. We got down with hooded lamps and inspected the floorboards over the clay. Nothing there but damp earth and a couple of rat runs too small for any grown man. Yet the feeling did not leave. The sense that the dark in the chamber was fuller than it had any right to be. That is how it begins underground. Not with revelation, with accumulation. Small insults to certainty arriving one by one until reason finds itself defending territory that gets smaller each day. Our war with the heretic engineers continued, perhaps intensified, and in any other season would have consumed all attention. They laid a deceptive listening tube behind loose stone in one buttress niche. Micah found it by accident while clearing dust and almost drove a chisel through his own hand in surprise. We plugged the tube with sanctified oil-soaked cloth and set a whisper pipe beside it. For 2 evenings we fed false numbers and staged a conversation about withdrawing from the eastern branch. The enemy shifted pressure precisely where we hoped. Tomas and I laid a compact charge beneath their probable line and collapsed the approach. Again, a success. Again, the result subtly favored movement toward the south because maintaining the deception required us to redistribute men and timber there. Every move we made felt tactically sensible. Only later did the pattern become obvious. Janik vanished on a listening watch with me no more than 10 paces behind him. Gallery 18 was a low tube in competent sandstone, only intermittently timbered. Procedure placed one man forward on the sounding mat with ear trumpet and one behind with notebook and hooded lamp. Janik signaled probable movement ahead and slightly below. I marked it. He shifted, lay still again, raised one finger for perfect silence. I waited, listening to my own pulse and the tick of cooling rock. Then I reached to touch his boot for confirmation and touched empty clay. No one has ever offered me an explanation for that moment that fits the facts as I experienced them. He did not crawl back past me. He did not rise. He did not brush the wall. He was present, then absent, in a gallery too narrow for trickery and too straight for concealment. The only object left where his chest had been was the ear trumpet, still trembling faintly on the ground. I shouted then, "Discipline be damned." Tomas and Micah came running from the support niche. We searched like madmen because that is how men search when method has nothing useful to offer. We sounded the walls, checked every crack, scraped the floor for hidden seams. Near the gallery end, Thomas found a hairline fracture in the clay. A tap of the chisel opened a narrow natural pocket no deeper than a forearm. Inside lay 3 pebbles, a fragment of old bone, and a crust of black residue Father Soren later identified, uncertainly, as pitch or bitumen. Command called that disappearance stress and confusion. Sergeant Bale flattened a tin mug against a support post and informed the command clerk that men do not become confused into stone. After Janek's loss, sleep became an organized military problem. We tied wrist cords between adjacent pallets so any missing man would wake his neighbor. We ran ash lines across the chamber threshold. We hung an iron charm of St. Adelar above the entrance, even though Father Soren privately admitted he did not know whether its approved use extended to subterranean military quarters. Fear broadens theology in very practical ways. The ash was disturbed twice. Nobody admitted crossing it. Then came the period I remember now as the counting weeks, because all of us began counting things in secret to defend our minds from what we could not explain, counting breaths until shift change, counting hammer strokes between enemy pauses, counting the men who entered the southern drift and the same men coming back, counting the seconds between odd noises and the next lamp flare, counting how often a familiar voice in conversation needed to be heard twice before you trusted who had spoken. I counted maps. Every old sheet in the hollow went through my hands eventually because no one else in the section liked paperwork and I preferred written uncertainty to spoken rumor. The more I compared the plans, the less I trusted the history they claimed to preserve. Older silver mine surveys showed a more complicated understructure beneath the southern branch than current military copies admitted. Feeder shafts, drainage drops, exploratory bites into lower stone, and one broad-worked area marked only with an erased title and a little cross-hatched warning circle. Later copies simplified all of that into collapses and pious labels. Sainted names had replaced descriptive ones. Measurements had been rounded. Intersections that once clearly met now merely approached. It looked less like negligence than deliberate devotional laundering. I began building a composite map from the layers. By tracing old lines against new damage reports, I could guess where certain buried volumes still existed. Tomas watched me one night as I crouched over the board with 3 lamps and a ruler worn smooth at the corners. "You're courting unhappiness," he said. "I'm identifying liabilities. Same thing underground." He was right. But liabilities ignored do not become kinder. Meanwhile, the enemy kept pressing, but never quite where a straightforward breakthrough would make sense. Sounds would begin on our left. We would counter-dig and find nothing. 2 days later, a probe would threaten the rear vent line and force us to reinforce the southern branch to preserve airflow. We built a resonant timber frame in a dead-side gallery that mimicked the rhythm of 2 men cutting medium-depth approach work. The false noise successfully drew enemy effort toward that useless line. When we buried the approach they had committed to it, we discovered their actual pressure had shifted under the south bend while we watched the decoy. Sergeant Bale called it professional cunning. Father Soren called it temptation by geometry. I called it impossible luck on the enemy's part until the maps persuaded me otherwise. A few days after that, we caught our first glimpse of them with living eyes rather than through earth and inference. Micah and I were clearing a freshly dropped pocket near the east branch when a timber groaned ahead and a wedge of wall slumped inward. Through the new crack I saw, just for a second, lamplight moving in another gallery perhaps 6 feet away. Not ours. The passage beyond was lower and narrower, shored with dark timber and hung with little strips of cloth or skin that turned slowly in the air current. A man crouched there with his back to us, shoulders wrapped in a patched leather coat blackened by clay. I could see the nape of his neck, the line of one ear, the ordinary, ugly humanity of him. Then he turned enough for the lamp to catch his profile. His face had been tattooed or scar-cut from temple to jaw in rows of tiny script I could not read. He grinned at us through the fissure, not with hatred, with recognition. Then he struck something metal behind him. The gallery went dark, a charge boomed somewhere deeper, and the wall between us collapsed completely. By the time we breached the rubble, there was no passage left, only a choked pocket and the reek of tar and incense. That sighting unsettled me more than any direct attack would have done, because his expression suggested not triumph but patience, as though he had already seen the shape of our future and only needed us to keep playing our part. The following shift, Sergeant Bale authorized one of our ugliest but most necessary countermeasures, a silent knife team posted in a narrow interception cut where breakthrough seemed probable. There are moments in tunnel war when noise is more dangerous than murder. Tomas, Bale, and I took the station with lamp hoods closed, kneeling in total darkness beside the expected breach point while Micah waited 30 feet back with a covered lantern. We listened to enemies scraping draw nearer grain by grain, felt little dust trickles strike our sleeves, heard whispered words in a language I did not know. Then a hand broke through the clay, feeling for air. Bale seized the wrist. Tomas drove his blade through the gap. The man on the far side convulsed once and made no cry at all. Another hand grabbed for him. I stabbed blindly. The breach widened, somebody on their side started to shout, and Micah uncovered the lamp so we could finish the work before they brought a charge to bear. We killed two and collapsed the opening before the rest could force through. Even that fight did not end cleanly. One of the dead had lodged half in and half out of the breach. Shoulders on our side, hips still in theirs, as if the earth itself had bitten him in two. We had to drag him clear quickly before his comrades used the obstruction to lever the gap wider. His coat was caked in blackened clay and smelled of incense burned over old fat. Around his wrists he wore little cords with knotted metal teeth threaded onto them. Not trophies, I think. Counting devices, perhaps, or prayers rendered in a form too practical for beads. Micah nearly dropped the lamp when the second body's eyes opened. That was only post-mortem muscle, I am certain now. At the time, no one spoke with such certainty. Thomas slammed the man's head against the wall hard enough to remove the question, and the silence afterward felt worse than the struggle had. We sealed the breach with sandbags, plank, and a hurried clay pack while Bale stood listening for pursuit on the far side. None came, which was somehow more disquieting than renewed attack. Afterward, we found on one body a string of little lead seals impressed with the image of an open mouth, not a symbol I recognized. Father Soren took them without comment, and later I saw him burn them over the brazier instead of preserving them as evidence. The point is this. By then the enemy no longer felt like a remote pressure represented by taps in clay. They had become personal, skilled, deliberate, and invested in some design that exceeded ordinary mining warfare. That should have made the pattern clearer to us. In truth, it only tightened our focus on immediate contests, because human enmity is easier to hate than strategic mystery. There was one week in particular, the third, I think, though underground time slips loose from calendars, when the contest with those heretic engineers became almost scholarly in its malice. They began laying decoy fractures instead of decoy sounds. By prying natural seams and dusting the cracks with fresh spoil, they created the illusion of recent movement in sections they had no intention of using. Any competent Antioch engineer would feel obliged to inspect such seams, because an ignored fracture can become a chambered breakthrough beneath your feet. So we inspected them. We timbered some, sealed others, posted listeners at still more. Every one of those responses consumed men and certainty. Meanwhile, their real efforts continued behind cleaner walls. We answered by weaponizing our own repairs. I devised a trick with layered boards and packed clay that made a newly sealed passage appear weak from the far side. An enemy miner breaking through would encounter what seemed like rotten support and naturally increase pressure at exactly the wrong point. We used that trick twice. The first time it killed one attacker in the collapse and drove the others back, cursing. The second time the enemy adapted by sending forward not a man, but a hooked pole to test the wall. When the false weakness gave way, they did not commit bodies at all, merely laughed from the darkness and withdrew. Hearing the enemy laugh underground is different from hearing it in open war. It arrives as proof that someone you cannot fully reach has just understood you. Another time they tried smoke doctrine. They lit some foul mixture in a lower vent and let the fumes travel through old stone routes until a sweet metallic reek surfaced in our west branch. Not enough to poison immediately. Enough to make men lightheaded and mistake ordinary shadows for motion. We countered with wet cloth baffles and reversed draft using a hand-cranked bellows rig stolen from an abandoned forge works. For 4 hours, Arvo and Len turned that rig in shifts until both had blistered palms, while Micah and I crawled the vent trunk looking for the enemy feed point. We found it only after tracing a thread of soot to a drilled hole no wider than a thumb joint. On the other side, someone had fixed a little iron charm shaped like a weeping eye. Whether mockery or ritual, I do not know. I crushed it under my heel and immediately felt foolish for touching it directly. The week also brought our closest thing to a pure military success. Janik detected a heavy concentration of enemy labor beneath an eastward salient where our front trench projected slightly. If they chambered there successfully, they could drop half the parapet and open a killing lane for surface assault. Bale authorized our largest deliberate countermine of the campaign. We cut for 16 hours in relays, silent except for tools wrapped in cloth. We chambered the explosive in bad rock while the air grew so stale that lamps rimmed blue. Father Soren blessed the fuse because men wanted blessing more than because anyone believed powder cared about liturgy. Then we fired. The result was magnificent in the ugly technical sense. The surface above jumped. 3 enemy shafts pancaked. Their vent line tore open in 2 places. Even topside infantry cheered when the ground belched dust from the Heretic side of no man's land. For perhaps one entire evening we believed we had seized the initiative. That same night, while men smiled for the first time in days and spoke of finally forcing the enemy back from our sector, a new tapping began in the southern branch with the exact rhythm Janik had once described as patient men not afraid of depth. There is the pattern again. Every success was answered not by defeat, but by redirection. Then came the night Micah heard singing. He woke the chamber by clapping both hands over his own ears and begging us to make it stop. At first I thought he had gone mad from lack of sleep. Then I listened and heard it too, faint and deep below the boards. Not words, not a hymn, but enough rising and falling structure that the mind wanted to call it singing. Len started praying. Tomas jammed a knife point between 2 floor planks and levered them up. Beneath lay compacted clay and the timbered crawl to the support wall. The sound stopped the moment air reached the space. We searched until shift time and found nothing. In the morning, Father Soren asked Micah what the song had reminded him of. Micah answered too quickly. Nothing. Soren nodded as if that answer itself meant something. Much later, Micah admitted it had sounded like his mother singing over wash water when he was a child. That, more than volume or melody, is how the thing under St. Barakiel's hollow worked, not by creating generic fear, but by stepping exactly into the shape of private memory. I spent those weeks amending survey sheets by lantern light, marking fresh support loads, seep lines, probable voids, and all the ugly little corrections that keep other men alive. One night, after tracing our newest counterheadings in red pencil, I stepped back and saw the shape of our own movement at last. Our active fronts described a reluctant curve. Every enemy threat and every response of ours had gradually yielded safer ground and concentrated our manpower, stores, and digging effort around the old, uncertain southern workings labeled Lower Pilgrim Vein. I took the map to Sergeant Bale. He studied it for a long while, jaw working. "You're saying they're pushing us," he said. "I'm saying every time they threaten somewhere else, the ground we decide we cannot lose sits a little closer to this sector. Then they want poor footing. Or something under it." Father Soren, drifting up behind us soundlessly as always, laid one finger on the old label. "This name troubles me," he said. "Because of pilgrims?" Micah asked, trying to laugh and not quite managing it. "Because miners do not name a vein for pilgrims," Father Soren said. "That is a devotional renaming, a later veil over an earlier truth." As if the earth objected to being discussed, a very soft 3-beat knock sounded from somewhere below the known floor. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The exploratory heading into the South Break Line was authorized the following day, officially to intercept suspected enemy galleries before they could chamber beneath our East Branch. Unofficially, Sergeant Bale wanted answers, and I did not blame him. Better to confront bad ground deliberately than be nudged into it one compromise at a time. There was also the practical question of whether we could seal it blind even if we wished to. The old cut sat too close to active supports and too near the routes by which our own listening branches were supplied. A hasty collapse in ignorance might have dropped the wrong weight into the wrong void, vented pressure back into occupied galleries, or opened a cleaner path for enemy miners along some buried seam we had not yet charted. Bale said, with the bitterness of a tired engineer, that every fool on the surface thinks just bury it is an instruction rather than a calculation. He was right. To close it safely, we first had to understand what exactly it was connected to. Even so, we did not simply batter through and descend at once. The next day and night were spent widening the approach by cautious feet rather than yards, shoring every fresh bite of exposed earth and sketching the old seam as it emerged. We cleared spoil in wicker baskets, used hand tools where we could instead of charges, and paused repeatedly to listen because no one trusted the quiet ahead of us. That delay did not feel dramatic while we lived it. In memory, it was the last interval in which the future still seemed negotiable. Before we ever laid steel to the old southern plug, however, there came 4 days in which our lives narrowed into waiting, measuring, and trying not to admit what we were waiting for. Those days matter because dread underground is rarely born in the dramatic moment alone. It is cultivated by repetition. A sound once may be ignored. A sound every night becomes law. We worked ordinary engineer labor while fear matured around it. We checked vent pressure with lamp flames, recut sagging beam seats, shored wet sections with scavenged timber, and crawled out along listening niches barely broad enough for shoulders so Janek could press his trumpet to the wall and tell us whether the enemy was cutting near our left flank or merely pretending to. Meals arrived in dented tins and were eaten half-warm at best. Sleep came in fractions. Boots remained laced because no man trusted having to find them in a dark panic. We became efficient in all the ways tired men do become efficient. Fewer words, quicker hands, smaller humor. Yet over and around that routine, the mind kept teaching us a new grammar of unease. One watch would pass almost peacefully, enough that shame crept in and made you suspect you had let yourself be frightened by ordinary strain. Then, as soon as relief settled into your muscles, some tiny, impossible thing would happen. A tool left on a crate would be found balanced upright in the dirt. A lamp that had been trimmed properly would begin guttering as if starved, though the vent cloth behind it bellied outward with good air. Chalk marks would vanish from a wall and reappear 20 yards away at the exact same height, the line unbroken, as though the stone had moved instead of the mark. We started keeping track of such things in the manner soldiers adopt when they are 1 degree from superstition but not yet willing to call themselves there. Tomas scratched incidents onto the back of a powder manifest. Micah marked times of unexplained sounds on a ration wrapper and compared them against shift changes. I wrote practical observations in the margins of my survey notebook and told myself that was what I was doing. Practical observation, not fear made literate. But once written down, the pattern looked worse, not better. Disturbances clustered around moments of vulnerability, sleep rotations, prayer, meal breaks, relief handovers, the brief intervals when hands were occupied and minds elsewhere. That was when I first began to think not merely that something hunted us, but that it studied procedure. Even before we opened the old drift, the days leading to that decision became a campaign of attrition against nerves. The heretics began targeting our sleep cycles with tactical precision. They would cut noisily and almost clumsily for hours while our active shifts remained alert, then fall silent the moment men lay down. 20 minutes into chamber quiet, a sudden hammer strike would come from some impossible depth, followed by stillness long enough that you wondered if you had imagined it. Then perhaps two voices speaking on the other side of a wall in tones just low enough to suggest words without surrendering any. Then silence again. The result was not direct military advantage so much as erosion. Men stopped entering sleep fully because they feared missing the one real warning buried among the false ones. We answered with rotating sound drills. Thomas devised them. 3 knocks from the watch meant routine enemy noise. 2, fast 1 slow, meant probable near breakthrough. A continuous drag on the cord line meant collapse. In theory, the system gave tired men certainty. In practice, it trained us to expect interruption at all times. More than once, I woke already halfway to my boots because some sound in a dream had resembled our warning code. There was also the matter of the missing tools, not stolen in ways a quartermaster could notice immediately. Shifted, misplaced, found in the wrong gallery. A chalk stub left by the map board turning up in a southern niche 70 feet away. A brace hammer discovered on top of sealed powder tins, though no one admitted putting it there. Father Soren's little brass oil spoon twice appearing beneath Carol's empty pallet after the man had already vanished. Rational explanations existed for each event. Exhaustion, poor habit, borrowing and forgetting. Yet the accumulation of them produced a uniquely underground paranoia, because if objects could move without trustworthy human intention attached to them, then the galleries no longer felt wholly governed by men. Once I found a measuring line stretched neatly along the wall of an abandoned spur we had not entered in a week. At the end of the line, tied with engineer's competence to a nail in the timber, hung one of Janek's ear trumpets, clean, polished, waiting. I took it down and said nothing to the others for an entire day, because I could not bear to hear my own description aloud. The company command above us continued reading the situation in purely tactical terms. Their memoranda asked whether enemy mining pressure increased, whether additional gelignite was required, whether the South Branch could support a larger countermine team. Nothing in those papers made room for questions like why old erased maps seemed to point toward a devotional chamber, or why men were vanishing from lit spaces without exit traces. We might as well have been trying to report weather to fish. By then, even Sergeant Bale's stubborn realism had started fraying at the edges. I know because one night I found him alone in the map alcove touching the scraped note about Lower Pilgrim vein with one thumb as though hoping texture might reveal what ink had hidden. "You ever think of refusing an order underground?" he asked without looking up. "Yes," I said. "Ever done it?" "No. Nor me." He let out a breath through his nose. "That's how holes like this keep getting deeper." The next day he requested ecclesial review. The review did not arrive in time. History prefers its specialists late. He chose me, Tomas, Micah, 2 labor men named Arvo and Len, and Father Soren. We started by cutting through a plug of collapsed marl harder than natural fall should have been, because whoever closed it years ago had packed brick rubble and lime through the spoil. It was a deliberate seal, not an accident. Behind it we found a descending drift, dry as bone despite the surrounding damp, blackened cedar timbers banded in iron, and shallow wall niches every dozen feet where old lamp bowls still clung to stone. The air moved very faintly inward. Arvo spat and said he disliked that. In a sealed place, moving air means another opening. Another opening means either the enemy or history, and underground those are both dangerous. We advanced anyway. For perhaps 50 yards we heard only our own movement. Then Micah stopped so hard Thomas nearly walked into him. At first I thought he had seen a crack or trip line. Then I listened. From very far ahead or below came a sound like many people murmuring through cupped hands. Too faint for words, too continuous for ordinary speech. It rose and fell irregularly without rhythm or pattern. Father Soren began quietly reciting office. Thomas muttered that it was air in fissures. Nobody believed him, not even Thomas. We marked the drift, took measurements, and withdrew. Command approved widening the approach, establishing a listening post there, and preparing a demolition niche if evidence of enemy occupancy emerged. That meant, in practice, more men in the old southern workings, more traffic, more stores, more time spent breathing the dry, wrong air that moved inward from a place no map adequately described. The nights worsened. Len woke screaming because something had tugged his blanket from the foot while the wrist cords kept him anchored to the pallet. Tomas nearly brained a shadow he swore had been crouched over Micah's bed. We found 3 fresh scratches cut into a pallet frame too evenly spaced for rat teeth. The rear ash line was smeared into circles one morning, though both assigned sentries denied leaving their stools. I examined the edge of Len's canvas blanket where he insisted cold fingers had gripped it and found black residue ground into the fibers, smelling not of lamp soot, but the same tarry pitch from Janik's crack in the wall. What made these incidents so damaging was not simply fear, but interruption. No event killed many men at once. Instead, each broke the machinery by which tired soldiers remain functional. A man shaken awake in terror does not properly calculate charge weight at dawn. A sentry who has spent half a watch staring at a doorway he is certain whispered his name cannot afterwards swear with confidence what he did or did not see in a side drift. We grew slower in tiny ways. We repeated measurements. We checked knots twice. We snapped at one another over trivial errors and then apologized with an embarrassment more corrosive than anger. The mine was making us waste strength before the real crisis even began. I remember one particular sleep period because nothing overt occurred, and yet it was among the worst. We had finally settled after a long spell of distant heretic cutting. Lamps were hooded low. Men breathed with that uneven, congested heaviness of miners sleeping in bad air. I lay awake counting drips, waiting for my thoughts to flatten enough for sleep. Then I heard footsteps outside the chamber, light and deliberate, not in the brisk economy of a sentry, but in the hesitant pacing of someone searching among the pallets for a familiar face. The steps went past the entrance, stopped, came back, and stopped again, exactly opposite my blanket. I did not lift my head. Neither, I later learned, did Tomas from the pallet beside me. We both lay there with eyes open, each pretending to sleep because waking the room felt somehow more dangerous than stillness. After perhaps a minute, the steps moved away. At morning watch, there were no prints in the dust, but Micah's boots, which had been placed beside his pallet, were standing at the chamber mouth neatly side by side, toes pointing outward as if set there for a journey. The underground war above that dread continued without pause. Probe galleries, feints at the vent trunks, false hammering. Once we traced an enemy drainage route by floating lamp-black over seep water and watching where the stain vanished through an unseen crack. Once they nearly poisoned our sleeping chamber by reversing duct pressure through a hidden vent join. Only Micah's habit of checking flame lean on every lamp caught it in time. On another day, we listened to what seemed a straightforward enemy advance toward our west branch, sank a countermine to intercept it, and broke through not into men, but into an empty decoy chamber stocked with spent tools, stale lamp rags, and one dead mule left to rot for the air. The real approach had been 30 feet north, masked by the echo profile of the false heading. We collapsed that one only after losing 2 diggers to a sudden sand run. Every day there was enough practical danger to justify our attention. That, more than anything, made the other fear corrosive. Terror is easier to resist when it arrives alone, harder when it travels concealed inside ordinary duty. Arvo disappeared next, and after that no one in command used the word desertion again. He was on vent duty in the southern drift with Micah when the lamp flames bent inward all at once as if the passage had inhaled. Arvo turned to secure a tarred coupling, shouted something, and was jerked backward into the dark beyond the last timber set. Micah emptied his pistol blindly and was still trying to reload when we reached him, hands slick with blood. There was blood on the duct cloth and the wall. No body. This time there were traces, smears in the dust, heelless and interrupted, as if something upright only by convenience had crossed the passage in several uncertain steps. They ended against a wall veined with an old black mineral seam. I struck that wall with a hammer. It rang hollow. Sergeant Bale ordered the section cleared and a breach prepared. We tamped a small charge into the seam, withdrew around the bend, and fired. The blast opened a jagged hole into a void beyond and vented a wave of hot, dry dust across our faces. When it cleared, we saw cut stone steps descending into dark, older than any military tunnel in the sector. Beside the stair, some forgotten hand had carved an archangel with spear lowered toward the descent. The face had been chiseled away. If command had possessed any wisdom at all, they would have sealed that breach at once and sent for the highest authority in Jerusalem. Instead, they ordered investigation. Officers are often more frightened of unexplored military liabilities than of mysteries, because a liability can be blamed on them by name, while a mystery cannot until too late. We descended the following day in 2 files. Sergeant Bale, Thomas, Micah, Father Soren, myself, and Corporal Ivan Marr carrying charge components and spare lamp oil. A guideline was fixed to pitons above the breach, so panic, smoke, or darkness would not scatter us on the stair. No man wanted to be first over the lip where the broken seam became worked steps. Bale took it because he was Bale. I went third because an engineer who advises caution loses the right to hide behind others when caution proves insufficient. Behind me, Micah breathed too fast through his nose and tried to disguise it as irritation. Marr whispered fuse lengths under his breath as though recitation of measurements could protect him. Father Soren had stripped his kit down to almost nothing but oil, prayer cord, and a small iron cruciform spike wrapped in cloth. Even then, his boots sounded too loud. At the top of the stair, we still belonged to the world of campaigns, orders, and recognizable danger. With each step downward, that world receded. The guide rope rasped softly through our gloves. Our lamps made the stone shine in patches and left the spaces between overdark, so that the stair seemed to assemble itself only one piece ahead at a time. Several steps had shallow central hollows worn into them by long, vanished passage. That detail frightened me more than the carvings. It meant use. Not one ceiling, repeated use. People had gone down this way often enough to shape stone with their bodies. Twice we halted because someone thought he heard breathing below the limits of our own file. Both times the sound resolved into the chambered trick of air moving across some cut in the wall, or seemed to. On the second halt, I realized my left hand had crept up from my tools to the small Antioch cross at my throat. I forced it away. An engineer likes to think his hands belong to the world of causes and effects. Mine had already begun defecting to older instincts. At the bottom, we entered a chamber no military engineer had made. The descent to it deserves its own telling because fear did not wait for the chamber itself. It began on the stair. The steps were too regular to belong to ordinary mine work and too narrow to be comfortable for armored men. Whoever had cut them expected traffic in solemn file, not laborers with spoil baskets. The walls sweated a dark, resin-smelling damp despite the dryness of the drift above. Here and there old tool marks crossed newer scratches as if generations had argued in steel over whether the place should be opened or closed. Halfway down, Sister Calv stopped and touched a line carved into the stone at shoulder height. "It has been sealed more than once," she said. "How can you tell?" Micah whispered. "Because the prayers change." That answer helped nobody. Lower still, the air acquired a layered quality that made each breath feel inhabited. Imagine incense burned years ago, lamp oil, hot iron, old blood scrubbed from stone and never truly removed, and beneath all of it the mineral sweetness of a cave newly opened after centuries. My mouth watered in revulsion. Thomas muttered that the stair smelled like a reliquary buried in a butcher's cellar. No one corrected him. We found marks on the lower wall from hands dragged downward in dust long since turned to glaze. Human finger widths, some broad, some narrow, all descending. There were also heel scuffs pointing up, as if whoever made them had once tried to leave in haste. On the final landing stood a pair of iron staple rings set into the stone, old enough to have rusted into black flakes. Restraint points, I thought at once, and hated myself for the speed with which the mind supplied that explanation. Only after all that did the chamber open before us. It was not large, perhaps 30 feet by 20, but everything about it spoke of deliberate ritual architecture rather than mine utility. The stone was black-red, harder than the surrounding marl, worked into shallow vault ribs overhead. Broken plinths lined the walls. Shallow niches held only drifts of old wax, fragments of bone-white ceramic, and one snapped iron lamp stem green with age. The air in that chamber was wrong in a way I struggle to describe even now. Not bad, not toxic, wrong. Like the memory of incense burned in a place where no worship had occurred for generations, mixed with blood and the sweetness of corruption just beginning. In the center lay a circular depression ringed with empty iron sockets where some grate or cap had once been mounted. The depression had been filled with rubble, but not tightly. Heat shimmered very faintly upward through the gaps. On the far wall, layers of inscriptions covered one another. Prayers, names, warnings, military shorthand, strike-throughs, devotional scratches from many hands and many eras. One line in crude Pilgrim shorthand read, "Keep the weight upon it." Another, "No breach below third arch." Another, cut so deep my knife sparked against it when I traced the groove. "They call for help in our own voices." Father Soren stared at the wall like a man recognizing a nightmare from a childhood fever. "What is this place?" Micah whispered. "A cap chamber," Soren said at length. "Or once one. A seal built over some lesser breach. A little mouth." The stones in the center shifted with a crockery settling sound. Something below gave one small, wet sigh. Nobody moved. Professional habits saved us from panic. I forced myself to examine the chamber. Cracks radiated from the central pit into the surrounding floor. Upward stress had displaced one quadrant by nearly 2 inches. Whatever lay beneath had not merely remained trapped. It had been pressing against the seal for a long time. The chamber itself had become the thing barely holding. Corporal Marr knelt near the center. "There's a draft under the fill," he said. The rubble shifted again. From the black slot beneath came a child's voice saying my name exactly as my mother used to say it when rain came and washing still hung in the courtyard. Eli. Not a resemblance, not an impression. Her voice. My whole body leaned toward the pit before my mind understood what had happened. Thomas caught my arm and yanked me back hard enough to bruise. Then the pit spoke in Micah's dead brother's voice. I knew it from Micah's face, from the way all color left him. Then in Sergeant Bale's tone calling for a fuse line. Then in laughter none of us recognized. Father Soren began praying aloud at once, fast and flat and utterly sincere. The whispers softened, whether from the prayer or simply because they had already done enough. We withdrew to the stair mouth and argued there. Bale wanted immediate demolition. Marr pointed out that an uncontrolled blast might shatter the old cap without sealing whatever lay below. I added that the chamber's stress pattern suggested we needed weight directed inward from multiple points if we wanted burial rather than breach. Father Soren insisted higher ecclesial authority was required. Thomas asked how long such authority would take to arrive under shelling. Nobody answered. Then 3 rifle shots cracked from above. For one absurd fraction of a second, none of us moved, because the sound coming from the known world of rifles and men felt almost less believable in that chamber than the voices from the pit. Then training returned all at once. Bale swore. Marr snatched up the charge satchel. Micah nearly stumbled on the first stair because he could not stop looking back at the central depression as if afraid it might have grown closer while we argued. The guide rope burned through my palm on the ascent. We ran. At the breach, we found one waiting guard dead with his throat opened almost to the spine and the other missing. The guide rope had been severed halfway through by something that cut and tore at once. Black smears on the drift wall led away toward our active galleries. What followed was not battle in any form surface troops would recognize. It was contagion moving through confined space. Alarm bells, shouted contradictions, One section convinced the heretics had broken through, another swearing shapes were moving inside the vent ducts. I sprinted to the demolition alcove for gelatine and detonators, while Tomas and Bale built a barricade of sandbags and tool crates around the breached stair. The mine split into overlapping realities for the next hour. In one reality, the ordinary military one, enemy engineers and infiltrators were indeed pressing our lines and had to be resisted with rifles, grenades, knives, and collapses. In the other, stranger reality, men kept reporting impossible intrusions. Faces in the ventilation canvas, footsteps above occupied galleries where no upper level existed, voices using pet names no comrade should have known. Because both realities occupied the same narrow passages, command and terror interfered with one another at every step. I remember passing the central chamber and seeing Len trying to nail shut the rear storage niche while shouting that something inside kept asking him politely to let it out. I remember an infantry sergeant dragging one of his men by the collar because the man insisted his wife was waiting in the old south drift with a lamp. I remember Father Soren kneeling in the junction mud with one hand pressed to a trembling support post, as if listening through prayer rather than wood. None of those moments lasted long. All of them remain. At one point, the western branch sent word of breakthrough, and we nearly stripped the breach barricade to reinforce it. Then Micah, of all people, caught the deception. The messenger had reported the wrong lamp color for that gallery, describing warm yellow light where West Branch protocols used blue hoods after second watch. We sent scouts instead of reinforcements and found no battle there at all, only a dead communication runner and a wall on which someone had written, "Help us," in fresh dust with 3 different finger sizes. That was how narrow our margin had become. One correctly remembered detail prevented the whole defense from tearing itself apart. In the sleeping chamber, our threshold ash had been ground into loops. 2 pallets were overturned, though both assigned sleepers remained present, white-faced and trembling. Sergeant Bale's reserve fuse tin in the demo recess had been rifled through by hands that seemed not to understand the meaning of what they touched. One gelatine crate had been clawed open, but no charges removed. In the dust around it lay those interrupted heelless smears again. On the run back, I heard hammering in the left branch, the familiar quick triplet rhythm we had long associated with heretic miners. For one insane moment, relief washed through me. Human enemies, human rules. Then the same hammering answered from 2 other directions at once, impossible by our map, and beneath it came that low, many-voiced murmur, as if the mine itself had become a throat. At the barricade, Thomas had finished the sandbag wall. Corporal Marr was gone. His lamp stood on the second stair, still burning. We set a hasty charge regardless. Bale lit the fuse himself. The blast folded the breach and half the upper stair in a roar that drove us flat and filled the drift with choking dust. When the air cleared, a stone near the new collapse shifted outward from below. Not enough for breakthrough, enough to tell us the weight was no longer sufficient. Command finally panicked in the correct direction. Runners went topside for sanctified demolition stores, infantry reserves, and any ecclesial specialist close enough to reach us. The reply that returned was the usual masterpiece of rear area courage. Support delayed by shelling, hold the section at all costs. So we held. During the next 18 hours, the heretic engineer pressure increased sharply, confirming what I had begun to suspect. They were not trying to take our tunnels in the ordinary sense. They were pinning us, shaping us, forcing us to commit manpower and responses around the old cap chamber. West Branch charges, vent attacks, diversions at abandoned spurs. Every move designed not for territorial gain, but for shepherding. We had been fighting a tactical war inside a strategic trap. Micah said it aloud while repacking charges with shaking fingers. We were clearing their path, every time we thought we'd beaten them. Tomas, jaw clenched, answered without looking up. Then stop giving them the pleasure of hearing it. But silence did not make it less true. Before the missing guard came back, we endured 2 more days of siege beneath our own lines. Those were the longest days. Siege underground bears little resemblance to siege in fortresses or trenches. There is no horizon to measure, no visible enemy movement, no useful distinction between front and rear. Pressure can come through roof, wall, sump, air duct, or the minds of tired men. We held the southern complex in a state of perpetual partial readiness that drained strength faster than open combat. Half the company worked while the other half pretended to rest. Weapons stayed within arm's reach even during meals. Lamps were never allowed to gutter low. Every crossing was double-checked because a rope, wire, or timber left in the wrong place in panic could kill more cleanly than any enemy blade. The collapsed stair after our first hasty blast still shifted at intervals, never enough to break through, but enough to deny rest. Dust would powder out from between stones. A low click would sound as rubble settled somewhere below. Once, during a lull in surface shelling, we heard 3 deliberate knocks from the other side of the fall. Deacon Rui drove one blessed spike into the drift floor before the collapse, and the knocks ceased for several hours. Whether because the right mattered or because whatever listened below had grown bored, I cannot say. We began logging each disturbance as if paperwork might restore authority. Time, location, nature of sound, direction of dust ejection, air change noted by lamp, presence or absence of voice imitation. I insisted on this partly from discipline and partly because I feared what would happen if we surrendered entirely to anecdote. Strange events, when spoken only from memory, swell and breed. Strange events written down at least hold still long enough to be stared at. Yet the log itself became a source of dread. Read in sequence, the incidents did not look random. They looked inquisitive. A test at the collapse, a probe at the vent, whispering near the old sump, knocks again after prayer, silence whenever a larger body of men passed through. Activity most intense at the edges of fatigue. It was not assault in the military sense. It was pressure applied by something trying to discover where our attention failed. The Heretic engineers exploited every minute. They mounted a hard push against our western listening branch with proper military intent at last, forcing a real knife and pistol fight in a constricted traverse lit only by one shattered lamp. Reserve infantry held them, but the message was clear. While one hand kept us fixed at the southern breach, the other could still reach for our throat elsewhere. We answered with demolition discipline. I laid 2 small denial charges in the west line and marked a third pocket in case full abandonment became necessary. Micah and Bale flooded an old sump tunnel to foul another probable approach. Tomas rigged a deadman fuse on the vent trunk so that if the heretics broke the coupling and rushed it, they would inherit a face full of sanctified fire. All of that practical labor helped. It kept fear from becoming the only occupation in the mine. Yet every task was now performed under the awareness that the dark below the collapse was not merely occupied by enemies but connected to something the enemies themselves treated with caution. Several times we found signs that they approached the old sector only so far. Their footprints, when visible in dust or disturbed powder, ran close to the breach zone and then bent away. More telling still, their offensives around the south never behaved like men trying honestly to seize a breakthrough. Twice they withdrew from useful pressure just as a competent enemy might have exploited it. Once they left a listening spur deliberately underdefended, almost inviting us to collapse it and congratulate ourselves while our own redirections brought us nearer the old cap line. Their aggression had direction but not appetite. Even before the captured notes, that began to trouble me. It looked less like assault than shepherding. Once, a wounded heretic crawler we dragged from a half-flooded side crack clawed at my sleeve and rasped something in broken Antiochene before dying. I caught only 2 words clearly. Not open. That should have comforted me. It did not. If men cruel enough for heretic service feared the thing under the cap, then our situation was worse than any official report could capture. During the second of those days, I completed the composite map that finally made the whole trap legible. I spread every amended sheet, every old survey fragment, every new measurement from the southern drift, and traced our past 3 weeks of countermines in charcoal. The pattern looked almost ceremonial. We had been nudged in arcs. Their false approaches had not simply protected one hidden point. They had progressively removed every safer alternative so that when the old drift was breached, we would have no choice but to defend, investigate, and reinforce exactly there. It was not only strategy, it was choreography. I showed Bale, Roy and Sister Kheled. Roy frowned as though presented with a defective roof truss. Sister Kheled, after one glance, crossed herself and said, "They were driving you to the weight." The phrase chilled me because it matched the warning on the old wall. Keep the weight upon it. They had known. Some previous generation had known exactly what the burden of Earth was for. We revised the demolition plan after that revelation. Originally, I had intended the rear support charge simply to fold the sleeping chamber and choke the access. Now I recalculated to drive maximum mass toward the old cap line itself. More earth, more broken timber, more iron, more everything. If we could not sanctify properly, we would smother brutally. That recalculation took hours and demanded ugly trade-offs. Increase one pocket too far and the blast would vent upward, preserving lower voids. Put too much faith in the breach charge and the southern galleries might chimney open instead of compacting. The only solution was distributed failure, staggered close enough to force collapse but not so cleanly simultaneous that one premature slip would ruin the others. I remember scratching numbers onto a board slick with dust and sweat, while somewhere below the buried chamber muttered in stolen voices. That, too, is war. Making engineering calculations while hell chatters under your pencil. I drew the model 3 times because my own hand no longer trusted itself. First in charcoal over old survey lines, then in chalk on the door panel, then again by knife point in a strip of soft timber so the essential geometry would survive even if dust or blood obscured the rest. Bale checked my estimates without commentary. Calv examined none of the maths but questioned every assumption about void continuity. Roy asked only where weight would fall fastest. Father Soren, who knew enough engineering to be dangerous, pointed out 2 possible chimney paths I had ignored because I did not want them to exist. He was right. I hated him briefly for being right. The argument over sequencing lasted nearly an hour and was the most human thing we did all day. Should the breech pocket fire first to stun anything forcing its way upward, or last to collapse into already moving stone? Should the marl seam go at full load or reduced weight to preserve northward withdrawal for a few seconds longer? Could sanctified charges and ordinary gelignite be trusted to behave closely enough in one system, or were we designing a liturgy of misfire? Men under mortal strain will debate details with savage energy because detail is still negotiable, whereas doom is not. In the end, the decision was ugly and sensible. Simultaneous initiation for the support throat and marl seam, with Thomas primed to hand-fire the breech as close behind as conditions allowed. No clean certainty, only the arrangement most likely to turn collapse into compaction. Then, at the end of the second day, the missing guard came back. He came shambling down the southern drift, carrying his helmet under one arm. At first I thought he was wounded and walking badly. Then the lamp showed that his chest had been opened from collarbone to belly, and loosely packed with black earth and broken devotional tile. He was still moving, not naturally, as if several invisible handlers were sharing the work and not coordinating it well. His mouth opened and closed. He was trying to say the night password. Bale shot him twice through the head and once through the sternum. The body collapsed, twitched, and began dragging itself forward by the fingers. Father Soren doused it with sanctified oil and set it alight. Even burning it whispered in several familiar voices at once. The smell that followed was enough to make Thomas vomit into his sleeve without taking his eyes off the passage. After that, there was no use in preserving rational ambiguity. Whatever lay below could reach through flesh, could call with borrowed voices, could perhaps wear the dead long enough to move them, and our human enemies had spent weeks maneuvering us into contact with it. Near dawn, the promised reinforcements arrived at last. A reserve infantry platoon, 2 black-clad ecclesial deacons from Jerusalem, and a crate of sanctified charges. One deacon, Sister Kheled, examined the copied wall inscriptions and told us the place had a fragmentary archive name, the Little Throat of Kheled, sealed in the year of Ash for issuance of false pilgrimage and reciprocal voice temptation. I did not understand the phrase at first, only later. It meant, I think, that whatever lived below called men by what they loved or feared most, and by answering, men gave it passage. Deacon Roy carried a reliquary hammer and 6 iron spikes etched with old prayers. He studied my amended map and said, with the calm of a carpenter discussing roof repairs, Full ritual reclosure is beyond field conditions. Weight and fire will have to suffice. Engineers love priests who speak plainly. We prepared the only plan left to us. Destroy the southern complex from 3 points so the cap chamber and all connected voids would be buried beneath enough broken stone and marl to choke the breach. Not heal it, bury it. We would lose the whole southern branch, the old drift, several support chambers, and perhaps part of the east line besides. Better half a mine than an open mouth under the front. Preparation for that demolition took the better part of a day and deserves to be remembered, because the labor itself was part of the horror. People imagine climactic moments as wild and swift. In truth, the approach to catastrophe is often administrative. Lists, measurements, carried crates, argument over wire lengths, rechecking tamping bags, choosing which stores to abandon because carrying them out would consume precious time. Every minute we spent arranging the death of our own galleries, the mine around us continued making small sounds of occupation. I drew the final pocket layout on a door panel ripped from an old surface shed and laid it on 2 ammunition crates in the chamber. Bale, Tomas, Soren, Roy, Calve, and I worked through each route in detail. Which turns were still passable, where spare fuse would be stashed, which collapse might isolate which team, which prayer or signal would mean proceed regardless. This was not heroism, it was craftsmen trying to ensure their last ugly piece of work failed in the correct direction. There were practical problems everywhere. Sanctified charges, for one thing, were heavier and less forgiving than standard gelignite because the church never trusts explosives not to become theological statements. The casing for one crate had warped in transit, forcing us to rewrap sticks by hand while Calv muttered censures over each bundle. The wires available from stores were of 3 different makes and none matched perfectly. One coil had been gnawed through by something small and diligent. We spliced what we had, tested continuity where we could, and accepted that certainty was a luxury the hollow no longer offered. Then there was the human matter of deciding who would do which leg of the work. No one wanted the breech pocket, least of all. It lay closest to the old chamber and required placing charges within reach of whatever might force its way through if the rubble shifted. Thomas volunteered before Bale could assign anyone else. He did it with the air of a man stepping forward to carry sandbags, not because he feared nothing, but because he knew hesitation spreads faster than courage underground. Deacon Roy went with him carrying the spikes and sanctified oil. 2 infantrymen, both young enough that their mustaches still looked newly issued, rounded out the team. Bale chose the marl seam pocket for himself because it demanded both command authority and an engineer's eye. Calv insisted on accompanying him despite his obvious wish to spare her the danger. She answered that if they were about to drop half a hill onto a throat of hell, someone should at least be present who had read the proper condemnations in the original tongue. That left me the rear support throat, which was fitting in all the worst ways. I knew the sleeping chamber's structure intimately. I knew exactly where to place the charges that would turn our own refuge into falling weight. Intimacy is what makes sacrifice feel real. It is easier to burn a stranger's house than your own room. Before we began loading the pockets, I ordered the survivors to strip the chamber of whatever could still be carried north. Tools, spare food, maps, water tins, blankets, medical kit. Men obeyed in silence. Some moved briskly because labor is a refuge. Others lingered over absurd little belongings. A spoon, a broken medal, a letter so damp the ink had bled into blue clouds. Len tried to take an entire crate of bent nails until Thomas told him, not unkindly, that there would still be nails elsewhere in the world if we lived long enough to need them. What nobody said aloud was that in abandoning the chamber we were admitting the mine had already partly won. A sleeping room underground is more than a room. It is proof a place can still be inhabited by the living. Once you prepare to bury it with your own hands, the balance of ownership changes. While we worked, the voices below the first collapse returned at irregular intervals. Never loud, never enough to command immediate panic, just enough to keep every man's shoulders raised. Sometimes they sounded like pleas. sometimes like casual conversation overheard through floorboards in a neighboring house. Once I distinctly heard Yannick laughing at a joke Thomas used to make about quartermasters watering soup. Thomas heard it too. His face did not change, but he drove a wedge so hard into a brace post the timber split. Micah nearly refused the marl seam assignment then, not from cowardice, from honesty. He came to me in the storage alcove where I was checking detonators and said, very quietly, "If it speaks in my brother's voice when I'm wiring the board, I don't know if I'll keep my hands steady." I told him the truth, which was all I had left to offer anyone. Then keep them angry instead. He considered that, nodded once, and went back to work. The geometry was vicious. 3 pockets had to fire. The breached stair approach, a transverse marl seam beyond our active map, and the support throat beneath the rear half of the sleeping chamber where load transfer would fold the galleries inward. The breach pocket was meant to shear the stair access and throw broken mass back down into the cap chamber. The marl seam pocket would drop lateral weight across any side voids that might otherwise survive as vents or crawl paths. My support throat charges, if they fired properly, would cut the rear holding structure and send our own sleeping chamber down on top of the rest, forcing the southern works to fail inward rather than merely crack open. 2 charges would collapse ground. 3, fired in sequence close enough for mutual failure to propagate, might compact the whole sector. We divided into teams. Tomas took the breach pocket with Deacon Rye and 2 infantrymen. Sergeant Bale took the marl seam with Sister Calv, Micah, and a reserve corporal. I took the support throat because I knew the chamber timbering best. Father Soren came with me carrying the sanctified detonators against his chest like relics. Before we separated, Bale gripped each man's forearm and said, "If one pocket fails, we still fire the others." That is the kind of sentence engineers understand completely and do not revisit if they wish to continue functioning. The support throat lay under the sleeping chamber's rear section where 3 old loads met on a retaining wall half original and half military repair. To prep it, we had to pry up floor planks beneath the pallets while the survivors packed their gear and pretended not to watch. I remember absurd details from that hour. A bent spoon. Janik's spare gloves still on a peg because no one had touched them since he vanished. Micah's saint cards bound with twine. The ordinary debris of men's lives waiting calmly above a charge meant to bury their room forever. I crawled beneath the floor with gelatine sticks and tamping bags while Father Soren fed wire and detonator line. Dust sifted constantly into my mouth. Once I heard movement very close in the crawl beyond the retaining wall. Not scratching, not rat noise, but curious contact, like fingertips testing boards from the far side. Another time something exhaled through a crack near my hand, hot and sweet and putrid together. Tasks kept me sane. Measure, pack, wire, check. Fear has less room when hands are occupied. When we finished, Father Soren laid 3 fingers to the retaining wall and murmured a prayer I did not recognize. "Will it help?" I asked. "No," he said honestly, "but I would rather it be said than omitted." At the junction, we received Bale's tug on the signal line from the marl seam, pocket prepared. Thomas's line from the breach did not come. We waited. Dust drifted from some distant impact above. Rifle fire crackled and stopped. Then the breach line jerked once, hard, and went slack. "Could be cut off," Micah said. "Could be dead," Bale answered. We had no more time to debate it because the southern passages began to speak. Individual voices at first, Carol asking for a lamp. Yannick complaining about his bad ear. Mar saying he was trapped under a fall and only needed someone to clear his legs. Not convincing to the intellect, devastating to the heart. Voices of the missing arrive with a force reason never matches. Every man at the junction froze in some private grief. Then Thomas's voice echoed from the dark. "Elias! Fuse jammed. Need your hands." I took one step before Father Soren struck me across the face so hard my teeth clicked. "Not his voice," he snapped. The shock saved me. Shapes emerged at the edge of the lampline, 3 first, then more behind them, human-sized only by courtesy. One moved on backward bent knees with its arms folded wrong against its body. Another had no proper head, only a column of dark, from which several faces pressed and withdrew as if beneath black cloth. A third still wore enough of a heretic sapper's coat that I recognized the cut, though the body inside shifted as if inhabited by argument. The infantry fired. Muzzle flashes turned the drift into brief red tableaus. One creature burst open in black matter and broken tile and still came on. Another climbed the wall and ceiling together, fingers sinking into clay. Sister Calv stepped through gun smoke and drove one of Roy's blessed spikes into the coat creature's chest. It screamed in several familiar voices at once and tore itself apart in convulsions. Micah seized the charge board and shouted at Bale for the order. Bale hesitated 1 second. Not from cowardice, because engineers count consequences even at the edge of hell. If Tomas's pocket had failed, firing early might leave the cap only cracked. If we waited, we might lose the junction entirely. In that second, the wall behind us bulged inward, not metaphorically. The clay under the sleeping chamber support flexed like sailcloth in wind. Cracks shot through the marl. From within the wall, many small hands began tapping politely from the far side. "Fire!" I shouted, and drove Bale's hand down on the plungers with mine atop it. He did not resist. The support throat and marl seam charges detonated together. Light, sound, and force became one thing. The floor leapt. Lamps died. Timber screamed. The junction folded sideways in a roar of stone, men, and collapsing geometry. And then, through the vast, rushing dark, came a third detonation from the south. Tomas. Late, but enough. When 3 properly placed failures meet, voids stop being rooms and become pressure. The southern complex did not simply cave, it compacted. Roofs pancaked, old drifts folded, the cap chamber, the stair, the breached seam, the lower uncertain workings, all of it was driven down and inward under the weight of the hill. A blast of furnace-hot air shot up from below and then ceased so abruptly it felt like a giant hand had closed over a throat. I remember being thrown. I remember gripping Father Soren's sleeve in total darkness. I remember the sensation of the entire mind deciding at once that it had tolerated men long enough. When consciousness returned, I was in a wedge of survivable space no larger than a grave. One lamp still burned weakly. My left leg was pinned beneath broken timber. Blood and dust made mud of my mouth. Father Soren lay half-buried nearby, trapped from the waist down, face gray beneath the clay. Time after collapse does not behave like time in the open world. Pain narrows it. Darkness stretches it. Every small sound becomes either hope or warning. I had no idea whether minutes or hours had passed. At first I thought I had gone deaf because the great detonation had been followed by such total muffled stillness. Then I realized I could hear small things. Dust pattering from a crack, Soren's breath hitching, liquid ticking somewhere beyond sight, the faint metallic complaint of a bent nail working loose in timber. I tested myself methodically because panic loves uncertainty. Fingers, responsive. Left arm weak but working. Right hand bloodied, not broken. Ribs painful but likely intact. Pinned leg sensate below the crush, which meant agony but also hope. Lamp fuel low. Air stale yet breathable. I took stock as I had taught junior engineers to do after falls. Name injuries before imagination does. Inventory light before fear tells you it is gone. Establish the shape of your prison, because a prison with dimensions can still be worked upon by reason. The wedge around us was formed by one snapped support beam, 2 leaning slabs, and what looked like the collapsed corner of a tool recess. Soil and shattered marl had packed tight above the beam, giving us a roof that might hold for 1 minute or 1 day. Every few breaths, a few grains trickled down the slope near Soren's shoulder. Each trickle made me think, this is the one that becomes movement. This is the movement that becomes load. This is the load that ends us. Human beings can think an astonishing number of complete disaster sequences in the space between two falling grains of dust. My first coherent fear was not death, but the possibility that the collapse had failed and something from below now shared that pocket with us unseen. I raised the lamp by instinct and immediately regretted the movement when my legs screamed. The tiny chamber showed only packed rubble, angled boards, Soren's pale face, and a slice of black behind a fractured beam where the light did not reach properly. I kept watching that slice for a long time. Soren noticed. "If it were in here with us," he said after a while, voice little more than dust, "you'd know. That is not as comforting as you think." "No," he agreed. "It is simply true." We spoke intermittently after that, not from sentiment but because silence in a collapsed pocket can turn thought feral. We discussed practicalities first. Air seemed adequate, water none. My leg pinned but not severed, his lower body numb, which worried me more for him than he admitted. He asked whether I thought the third charge had really been Thomas's, or merely sympathetic detonation from the others. I said it had been Thomas. There are points at which faith in a dead friend is as necessary as oxygen. Somewhere beyond our little cavity, a slab shifted, and we both froze. Then came 3 faint taps. "Rescue code," I answered with the butt of the lamp. No reply came for what felt like an age. Then, very distantly, 3 taps again. The relief nearly unmanned me. Yet even there, after all that, the mine offered one final cruelty. During the long wait between rescue contacts, a voice rose from somewhere below or beyond the rubble, too muffled to locate, too clear to dismiss. It said, in my father's tone, that the weight was slipping and we had not buried enough. My whole body went cold. I must have made some sound because Soren turned his head. "Whose voice?" he asked. I told him. "Then do not listen," he said. "The trapped are always tempted to bargain with what speaks through stone." The voice came once more, softer, asking for help with a load-bearing arch just as my father used to ask when I was a boy, carrying tools for him. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood and recited timber counts until it passed. That was the last whisper I ever heard from the deep under St. Barachiel's hollow. Perhaps the collapse truly sealed it. Perhaps whatever lay below simply spent its reach in those final efforts. Either way, the silence that followed felt less like victory than exhaustion on both sides of a slammed door. When he saw I was awake, he made a sound that might have been a laugh. "We are not dead," he said. "Not yet," I answered. Around us, the collapsed mine settled in groans and tiny trickles. Somewhere very far below, muffled by impossible weight, came one final sound. Not words, not a voice, but a pressure forced through an obstructed throat. Then nothing. Not safety. Nothing is not safety underground, but the lesser mercy of silence from an enemy unable to answer back. Rescue took 6 hours. The surviving engineers and infantry dug from the north side, guided by tapping patterns Tomas had drilled into everyone during calmer days. Father Soren died before they reached us, his hand still closed around the empty detonator case. They cut me free with saws and entrenching tools, passed me hand to hand up through broken pockets, and hauled me into the surface trench beneath an evening sky so wide it hurt. Micah survived with burns and a tremor that never left his hands. Sergeant Bale survived, though something in him had been sanded hollow by the experience. Thomas was found crushed near the breached stair with the firing lanyard looped around his wrist. Sister Calv's body was never recovered. Deacon Roy was found blind and whole, both blessed spikes bent. Mar, Arvo, Karl, Janik, and too many others remained below forever. In the days afterward, proper authorities finally arrived in quantity. Engineers from Jerusalem, archivists, ecclesial surveyors with sealed cases and fresh gloves. They questioned me repeatedly while fever and morphine traded custody of my thoughts. Did the heretics know the cap chamber existed? Yes, almost certainly. Were they trying to open it? I believe so, or forcing us to do the work for them because they feared touching it directly. Was it truly a gate? I told them scholars could choose whatever term soothed them. I knew only that something below borrowed the voices of the beloved dead and wore the recently dead like tools. The official survey concluded that the southern complex had suffered total structural loss across 7 connected levels, including the old ceiling chamber. Subsurface settling implied a major void collapse beneath the original cap. In plain speech, we had dropped a hill onto the wound and probably choked it shut for a time. Probably. The distinction matters. A week later, a raid on a heretic dugout produced captured mining notes referencing the Pilgrim throat and driving the Antiochenes to the weight. That confirmed the poison at the heart of it. They had never truly been losing the underground contest at St. Barachiel's Hollow. They had been shaping it. Every false heading, every probe we proudly buried, every vent attack, every sacrifice of their own sappers to our countermine efforts had served the deeper design of nudging us south, thinning the old seal and making our hands breach what theirs perhaps dared not open by themselves. That is what stayed with me after the wounds healed badly enough to walk but not run. Not merely the dark, not merely the pit, not even the dead guard trying to speak the password through a chest full of black earth. What stayed was the understanding that competence itself had been used against us. We were not lured by obvious foolishness. We were lured by successful procedure, by doing our jobs well within the frame the enemy gave us. Every clever deception we executed, every precise collapse, every neat little tactical victory convinced us we still understood the shape of the problem. Men can survive fear. Men can survive darkness. It is much harder to survive the belief that your decisions are sound while those decisions walk you, step by reasonable step, toward damnation. They moved me off frontline tunneling after my leg healed enough to make me useful elsewhere. I trained new sapper cadres in New Antioch. I taught them ordinary things first because ordinary things save lives. How to shore wet marl, how to read fissure lines, how to detect false ventilation, how to count air draw by flame lean, how to map not only where the enemy is, but where he wants you to go. I made them repeat that last lesson until they hated hearing it. Hatred is cheaper than burial, and I taught them the lessons St. Barachiel's Hollow wrote in us. Never dismiss an unexplained underground disappearance as cowardice merely because cowardice is easier to report. Never sleep below ground without a counted watch and a physical tether. Mark every old name on a map and ask what earlier name was erased to make room for it. If voices in the dark call you by a beloved name, stop your ears and move backward. If a chapel is found beneath a mine, assume it was built there because someone before you had a reason stronger than architecture. And if the enemy keeps pressing the same miserable sector beyond all tactical sense, ask what lies one layer deeper that he would be delighted for you to uncover.
I still dream of the chamber. In the dream, the iron sockets still hold their grate. Lamps burn in the wall niches. Around the pit stand the first watchers, whoever they were. Miners, monks, soldier priests, perhaps all three at once. Dust lies thick on their shoulders. Their hands are calloused. Their eyes say the same thing our maps had forgotten, that weight must be maintained not only by stone, but by memory, and memory always fails before stone does. People ask whether I believe the little throat of Kheled remains sealed. I answer with the only honesty I have, perhaps for a time. Fronts shift, earth settles, water finds its way, old wounds remember where they are. Somewhere beneath that ruined ridge between New Antioch and Jerusalem lies a crushed chamber under tons of marl, timber, iron, prayer, and bone. Maybe the weight is enough. Maybe it is only patience piled thick. But I know this much. Before St. Barachiel's Hollow, I believed underground war was a contest of engineering, nerve, and skill against human foes. After it, I understood a deeper terror. That the dark beneath the front is not empty ground between armies, but a country already inhabited by hunger, memory, and old breaches waiting for human labor to uncover them. We engineers flatter ourselves that we shape the earth. Sometimes we do. Sometimes the earth, or what waits beneath it shapes us instead. And if you want to know what frightened me most, it was not the first whisper from the pit, not Orin walking with black earth packed into his opened chest, not the wall bulging with tapping hands from the far side. It was the weeks before all of that, when we thought we were winning. That was the truest part of the trap. The heretics did not merely lure us closer to the Hellgate. They let us believe our own competence was carrying the day. Every successful countermine, every enemy shaft neatly collapsed, every clever manipulation of their listening teams made us trust the pattern that was killing us. Men can endure horror better than they endure false mastery. So if you go below the front after me, remember this from a sapper who has heard the earth answer back. Do not ask only whether the enemy is ahead. Ask who benefits from every foot you advance. Ask what your victories are buying. Ask what forgotten thing is patient enough to let men excavate it in the name of war. And if, somewhere in a collapsed place between New Antioch and Jerusalem, a familiar voice calls gently from under stone, do not be proud enough to believe you can go nearer and still turn back. The earth does not always belong to the living.